Hello everyone. In continuation of my previous lecture about policy formulation content, I would like to continue with the same topic, that is, but in with further addition to the topic, that is, last time I had discussed about the actors who are involved, what is the notion, what is the concept of policy formulation, as well as the techniques. Today I'm going to talk about the models and the various steps or stages involved in the policy making system. Models are very extremely helpful in giving a clarity to the thoughts about policy formulation and to develop the relevant knowledge of policy. Some of the approaches or models are included, such as a rational model, incremental model, group theory model, elite theory model, institutional model, game theory model, and systems model. So the rational model, if we talk about the rational model of policy making, is also called the decision making model, and under this model the rationality principle emphasize that policy making is making a choice among various policy alternatives on rational grounds. So rational policy making is to choose the one with best option, and this it argues that in order to formulate effective policies, policy makers should be more rational, would be more logical, and the model suggests 5 steps to be followed in the policy making. A policy is said to be rational only when these steps are followed, and these are identifications of society's values, preference, and the relative weights, finding of policy alternatives which are available, evaluation of the consequences of each policy alternative which has been taken, and the calculation of the ratio of benefits to cost for each alternative. So, and then selection of the most efficient policy alternative. So they, these are very important. So in order to understand that which on the base of the rationality, one needs to understand that and that is the most feasible way of finding an alternatives, applying that alternative, selecting the most appropriate and efficient policy alternative, and then putting into use. So Herbert Simon, in fact, his name has been associated with this rational model. He talks of 3 kinds of activities which was included in policy making process, that is intelligence activity, design activity, and choice activity. The intelligence activity searches the situation, calling for a decision. The design activity identifies, develops, and analyzes public courses of action, and the chosen activity deals with selecting a particular course of action from those available. Then the second model, that is the incremental model. The incremental model to policy formulation was put forward by Charles Lindblom in his book Policy Making Process. Of all the models, the incremental model is popular because of the fact that it fits well with what actually goes on in government. So policies generally have societal character since they determine the fate of people. For this reason, any policy should not be formulated on a larger scale without understanding its repercussions. So hence Lindblom has proposed the increment model for policy making, and according to him, no policy maker or government would like to formulate a new policy. If at all the policy maker wants to formulate a new policy, he or she do it on a larger scale. So policies are introduced policies are introduced on a smaller scale in the beginning, and then they are expanded gradually. Under this model, it has been stated that the policies are expanded slowly and steadily after knowing the workability and feasibility of the policies. Like for example, if I say that the national education policies which was initiated in 1968 and in 1986, and the plan of action it in 1992 gave utmost priority to the elementary education of girls and focus on the removal of women illiteracy and obstacles inhibiting their access to education. So based on such objectives, the program of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was launched, and its objective was to bridge the gender gaps in elementary education, and so on and so forth. So the incremental model is widely used in a democracy country, and it focuses mainly on the larger, that how you need to expand one particular policy. Then there is a group theory model. The group theory model was put forward by a Japanese sociologist, Gitano Masako, and group theory is an approach which seeks to maintain equilibrium in the society, balancing the interest of various groups. So according to this theory, public policy is a product of group struggle. Individuals having a common interest and demand join hands together and form formal or informal groups in order to influence the politics of the government to suit their needs. So, on the basis of the equilibrium reached in the struggle of various groups is in the policy process, public policies are formulated. So, policy formulators, they succumb to the pressure of the dominant groups through bargaining, negotiating and compromising. Thus, in the process of group struggle, the demands and desires of the pressure groups enter the government arena and policy is formulated. Then we have the elite theory model. According to this model, public policies are formulated as per the preference and values of the elites. This model postulates that a society is divided into few segments, those who have the power and those who do not have it. So, policy in this social setup is not determined by the people or the masses. The ruling elite, that is the political executive, decides the policy, and this is finally carried out by the bureaucrats who form part of the next segment of the elites. So, thus according to this model, the policies tend to flow from the top and do not move from the bottom. Every society has its elites. They sometimes decide and they come into power with the process or with the desire to change or bring about certain agenda, or they have their own agenda in bringing about a particular policies. So the public policy is it becomes an important part of it, and in fact the elite theory explains the competition. The elite theory explains that competition to influence policies between the elites in power and the other elites attempting to come to power. So, the common masses on whose demands the public policies are formulated have limited or no influence in determining the policies. Thus, instead, policies are formulated by the ruling elite and the governing elite, and the bureaucrats only carry out those into effect. Okay, then we have the institutional model. If we talk about the institutional model, public policy is an institutional activity since it is formulated through cooperative effort. So, policy formulation is not an individual effort. Many people or many agencies join together and formulate a policy by following a set of rules and procedures. So, the institutions not only constitute crucial and significant nodal points for public formulation, but also determines the formulation or adoption of policies, their possible content and directions. The structures of the institutions and their arrangements and interactions have a significant impact on public policies. So, this model argues that the policy formulation is the outcome of the internal agenda of government institutions rather than the result of external pressures and influence. And this model also states that in policy formulation, power is exercised by different individuals and groups such as Prime Minister, members of parliament, bureaucrats, leaders of interest groups. So, in this model, policies do not take the shape of public policy unless they are adopted and implemented by the government institutions. So, the government institutions give public policies three distinctive characteristics. Firstly, the government gives legal authority to policy, and it gets the approval of the law by making body. Secondly, a policy also gets universal character as it can apply to the entire society. And thirdly, public policy is backed by coercive power since it is formulated by the government. Then we talk about the game theory model. The game theory talks about strategic decisions that players make in a competition, where each participant or player seeks to maximize gains and minimize losses. So in a competition, one person's gains becomes another person's loss. On similar lines, the game theory model is applied by is applied for policy formulation as well. A public policy may not provide advantage to all section of the population. Formulation of a particular policy may be gainful to one section of the society, whereas to another section it might be a loss. For example, formulation of gender sensitive policies may require men to give up certain privileges and take on certain responsibilities in order to achieve greater equity in the development outcomes. Then we have the system model policy. System model. The system models put forward by Easton views the policy process as a political system that responds to the demands of the environment. So, according to this model, a policy is the response of the political system to the changing demands and desire of the people. The political system consists of various interrelated institutions and activities in a society that comes up with policy decisions in the society. The environment provides inputs to the decision process in the form of demands and supports. Demands are claims of individuals or groups to satisfy their needs, and support is rendered when individual group or groups accept the decisions and actions of the political system that are made in response to demands. So there is a concept of, there is the inputs into the policy process are provided by outside interest, particularly from pressure groups, consumer groups, as well as the interest groups. So such environmental inputs into the political system are converted into outputs or policies. And there is also the concept of feedback in this model, which serves as a tool to know the advantages and disadvantages of the policy output. If you talk about the policy formulation process, policy formulation comprises several components, each impacting heavily on overall policy performance. And this view, the formulating process starts with the conceptualization of the problem by policymakers. Hogwood and Gunn, they have identified 9 important stages in the policies process: decide, that is agenda setting, deciding how to decide issue filtration, there is issue definition, forecasting, setting objectives and priorities, option analysis, policy implementation, monitoring and control, evaluation and review, and policy maintenance, succession and termination. In fact, the policy cycle as given by May and Wildavsky includes agenda setting, issue analysis, implementation, evaluation and termination. Similarly, James Anderson has also dealt with the description of the policy process, and his model of policy process has 5 stages, that is problem identification, agenda formulation, adoption, implementation and evaluation. So, if you could see, Thomas Dye has also set out following stages in the analysis of policy process, that is problem identification, agenda setting, policy formulation, policy legitimation, policy implementation and policy evaluation. So, there are basic linkages in a policy framework for the systematic analysis of information and its use in the policy related context. A basis to the framework is information for policy analysis, which is derived from the systems or programs performance in terms of interaction among inputs which indicate needs and demands process concerning the provision of services for long-term care, outputs in terms of the use of services and cost of care, outcomes which would identify the end results of certain courses of action. Now, if you look into the various steps, the detailed analysis of these various steps in policy formulation. The first is identifying underlying problem. Identifying under problem. For an analytical approach, the first step is to identify whether and why there is a problem at all. Defining the problem involves moving from mundane descriptions to a more abstract conceptual plane. Here it is an attempt has been made to diagnose the form of market failure, that is confronted. And suppose for an environmentalist who is investigating alternatives, pollution control measures, will find the water is being polluted, and so what alternatives can be done. So having identified the context of the problem, the next step is to determine what objectives are to be set to be achieved in tackling the issue. And it is very important, the basic, the pay one has to pay careful attention to the objective, and it becomes significant, it becomes very important that what the objectives are articulated in a proper manner. There is no ambiguity in the objectives. It gives a clear, it gives a clear picture of the what the policy is intended to bring about. Then determining the policy alternatives. The next step is to determine policy alternatives, or determine alternative course of actions. The next step is to determine the alternative course of action. Government intervention can take many forms, and it is very important to determine which kind of intervention it would be most positive. When you talk about, you have to come up with certain alternatives. So just that if suppose if a particular policy, if plan A is not working, then it is very important that what would be the plan, what would plan B would be. So they have to have certain options, certain alternative channels for making the policy work, and not relying on a single course of action. Then forecasting and evaluating alternatives. Having identified the underlying problem, and having determined the alternative for policy choice, the policy analyst evaluates the consequences of each of the alternatives which he has taken into his consideration. He will then return to a relevant model for forecasting consequences. Since the models, so one has to evaluate whatever alternatives the person has taken up for the policy implementation. It has to do the forecasting. It is necessary here to predict all the effects of the proposed policies, and just not about the economic efficiencies effects desired by the decision maker. If the consequence of an alternative course of actions are uncertain, and especially if the possible outcomes differ widely from one another, the analyst may wish to develop a decision tree and evaluate the probability of each outcome. So very often it is difficult to have a rational policy choice unless the relative merits of alternative options are analyzed systematically. So the cost involved in regulation and administration needs to be evaluated. Evaluation of the outcomes is of great importance, as it reminds us to look carefully at the cost benefit analysis of a particular policy choice. Then policy selection. The next step in the policy analysis relates to making the preferred choice, that is the course of action. And the situation may be so simple for the policymaker that it can simply look at the consequences predicted for each alternative, consequences of each predicted for each alternative, and select the one that is best. So in contrast, it may be so complex that the policy analyst will have to set out the order of preference among the various policies, various possible outcomes, that is in terms of how different set of stakeholders might respond to the possible choices and their outcomes. The policy processes may be represented, and it has been observed that there would be there have been countless policy studies which sometimes do not take the advantage of the data. So it is the analyst themselves who has to look into the proper choice of which course of action has to be selected, and it needs to evaluate the techniques of the policy, evaluating or coming up with a framework for evaluating the consequences. Then policy implementation, or we can say that policy action. In the final analysis, the success of public administration can be measured only in relation to the implementation of policies. So policy implementation is one of the critical importance to the success of government. However good the political system is, if however sound and clear goals are there, and if the policies, if no policies can succeed effectively if the implementation is poor, irrespective of the fact that how good the governance is and how well drafted objectives are there, and in how the organization structure has been. So in the most general form, implementation is a phase between a policy statement and operation, and it seeks to determine whether an organization is able to carry out and achieve the stated objectives of its policies. The exercise also involves developing and pursuing a strategy of organizations and management to ensure that the policy process is completed with the minimum of delays, cost overruns and problems. More specifically, the task of implementation is to form a bridge that allows the objectives of public policies or such policies to be achieved as outcomes of governmental activities. So it involves the creation of policy delivery system in which specific mechanisms are designed and pursued in the hope of reaching particular ends. Now, there are certain conditions for successful implementation. Implementation is seen varying along a continuum ranging from most successful to failure. But however, successful implementation involves many operations and procedures as well as time and resources. There are certain conditions where effective policy implementations can be meted out if applied properly. First, the program should be based on sound assumptions relating to changes in target group behavior in consonance with the program objectives. Then unambiguous policy directives and structures of the implementation process to enable target groups to maximize the performance. The leaders of the implementation agencies should possess substantial managerial and political skill and are committed to statutory goals. Then the fourth one, the program is should be actively supported by the organized groups and by a few key legislatures or the chief executive throughout the implementation process, with the judiciary being neutral or supportive. And then lastly, the relative priority of statutory objectives is not significantly undermined over time by the emergence of conflicting public policies or by change in relevant socioeconomic conditions. And so policy making does not end once a decision is reached. The implementation of a decision is just as important as a policy itself, and no policy formulator can assume that decision will automatically be implemented and as envisioned. Policy implementation requires a variety of actions, including issuing policy directives that are clear and consistent, creating organization units and assigning personnel with the information and authority necessary to administer the policies, then coordinating personal resources and expenditures to ensure benefit to target groups, and evaluating implemental actions of the personnel. Then policy monitoring. Monitoring is essential, a subset of the implementation process. It is an activity which occurs in the course of implementing policy or program. It is a process of monitoring that the implementer actually gets to begin seeing the results of the policy. And the objective of policy monitoring is to ensure through the policy implementation process that resources inputs are used as efficiently as possible to yield intended results. So the standards which are used for both efficiency of resource utilization and effectiveness of policy implementations are inherent in the policy making process. So the monitor has to constantly look out or rather take proactive measures in understanding able to appraise the resources, uh, bring up some technical activities in the policy implementation, which would result to make changes or to bring about any corrective actions whenever required and whenever necessary. So an effective monitoring of public policy aids in cost reduction, time saving and effective resource utilization. And the key issue in monitoring is to create an information system that would enable the policy makers and policy implementers to make timely decisions and policies. Then policy outcome, the next stage is in this policy cycle is the policy outcomes. They are different from outputs. Policy output are the actual decisions of the implementers. The concept of outcome lays stress on what actually happens to the target group intended to be affected by the policy. If the intended changes on target groups do not occur, then something might have gone wrong. So like state housing schemes for the poor may be used to illustrate, although maybe used can be used sometimes as an example. Like although one can find the fulfillment of targets including the physical presence of houses, it was observed that in majority of the instances the beneficiaries choice not to occupy them because they were not to their liking in terms of the size, ambience or quality of construction or some other deficiency. So the policy outputs were achieved but not the outcome. Then policy evaluation. The final stage of the policy process is a sequential pattern of activities, is the evaluation of policy. Evaluation is concerned with what happens once a policy has been put into effect. It is an assessment of the overall effectiveness of a program in meeting its objectives or assessment of the relative effectiveness of programs in meeting the expected objectives. So evaluation performs several functions in policy analysis. In the first place, it provides reliable information about policy performance. It measures the impact of policies on society. It reveals the extent to which particular goals have been achieved. It also helps to understand the degree to which policy issues have been resolved, and it also helps clarify the values that underline the selection of goals and objectives. Evaluation results in efforts to restructure policy problems. It may also contribute to the emergence of new goals and potential solutions through evaluation, or rather evaluation during the implementation process of a policy might suggest policy together. And in short, evaluation is primarily an effort to analyze policy outcomes in terms of the set of objectives, and therefore it helps in bringing about the utility of the policies under consideration. Then lastly, design of evaluation. Evaluating a public program involves the listing of the goals of the program, measuring the degree to which these goals have been achieved, and finally suggesting changes that might bring the performance of the organization or the state or the government more in line with the intended purposes of the program. So evaluation has a sensitive side of it, and it may sometimes become a point of conflict or reinforce pre-existing conflicts. So negative evaluations of the performance of a public program may result in its termination. So the content of an evaluation, the goals that are contained in it, and even the organizations performing the functions, all of them will affect the final assessment. So therefore there is a need for a careful design of the evaluation work by competent workers. So these were the various steps in the policy formulation, and I've explained all the essential steps and all the important points which are required in the policy formulation, starting from the agenda setting or identifying the problem, prioritizing the problem, determining policy alternatives, doing forecasting, choosing the appropriate alternatives, selecting, implementation, monitoring, outcome, and lastly, along with evaluation, designing the appropriate method or designing the appropriate tool of evaluating a policy. So lastly, it can be said that the use of policies process can bring benefit to the analysis of public policy. Policy analysis develops their own styles and a personalized way of or orchestrating information. And this is important because policy making in a federal system like ours is very complex. So the constitutional order, it sets the parameters for the policy making process, and the constitution asserts that the policy making should be deliberative. It should cater to the larger